So I have the good fortune to serve one of 21 regional centers in the state of California. I'm the program director for creating behavioral and educational momentum for North Bay Regional Center. And the state of California is very fortunate to have 21 regional centers serving the needs of developmentally disabled individuals, including individuals on the autistic spectrum. And that's unusual because other states don't have that level of support. So good fortune to be in the state of California. I'm going to talk about my years of experience providing both crisis stabilization services, in this case to adults on the autistic spectrum. I also have experience with individuals that have been diagnosed with schizophrenia and bipolar, and I'll talk more about what the difference is because sometimes the symptom profile seems to get confused. And we're currently seeing a wave of individuals on the autistic spectrum that are reaching adulthood, which is in the developmental world 22 years of age and older, and they're having profound needs that have often gone undermet and underserved. So I get the good fortune to try to meet those needs in creative ways. What we're finding is both in terms of the birth rate, once was 1 in 2,000, and then now I've heard as recently as not just 1 in 65, but possibly 1 in 50 individuals on the autistic spectrum, and then over 600,000 are expected to reach adulthood, 22 years or older, in the next 10 years. So that's a huge amount of need in our community that we need to meet. And I'm very interested in how we can do that in the most effective way possible, given my task of meeting critical moments in time when individuals go into crisis. And I also do a lot of training for first responders, police, sheriffs, emergency rooms, crisis stabilization units in terms of how to create stability when there's an escalated moment for someone on the spectrum, because there's very particular ways to do that that are more effective than not. And often when first responders are not trained properly, they can escalate a situation versus de-escalate and create stability. So in that way, a couple of things I'll be speaking to is what is the difference between an individual living on the autistic spectrum and individuals that have classically or more typically truly been in the realm of psychosis. And then I'm also going to talk about what works. What do we know that works? One of the reasons why I want to make that differentiation is what I see a lot when I get a call as the director of a crisis stabilization service is people are misdiagnosed. I got a call for someone in a supported nursing facility that was 57 years of age. The face sheet said schizophrenia. I entered the supported nursing facility to assess the situation, and pretty quickly it was pretty evident that the individual had all the hallmark features of an individual on the autistic spectrum, but because he was 57, he had never been diagnosed. So obviously we then go to our team of consultants, psychiatrists, psychologists, doctoral level BCBA individuals with a background in applied behavioral analysis to see how we can create stability. But most immediately in a crisis situation, I wanted the staff at the supporting nursing facility to understand what things they could do and they can do most immediately to create stability. And in that way was suggesting for this gentleman that if they could do what would be more informed by applied behavioral analysis, creating a lot of consistency, schedule, routine, using visual tools, visual calendar, visual schedule, that would be helpful. So when we trained the staff at the supported nursing facility to implement these best practices for autism, the individual calmed down and we didn't get another call. And that person had been kicking and swatting and biting the nurses who were trying to provide aid, and was pretty much plied with a lot of antipsychotic medications. The individual was on the autistic spectrum. Later did get a rediagnosis, a full assessment, and was determined to be on the autistic spectrum. And in my caseload in North Bay of 500 individuals I've served in the past 4 years, I would venture to guess probably 30 to 35% of my caseload has been diagnosed schizophrenia and they're actually on the autistic spectrum. It's huge. It's massive what's going on out there. So what is, to operationalize that, if I were to make that, if you're a first responder and you're showing up on a scene, how do you determine the difference? One thing that we know is that individuals on the spectrum can respond to tools. If you give them a visual schedule, if you give them tangibles, certain tools often creates a lot of stability pretty quickly. Individuals that I've worked with in the past 20 to 25 years that are truly in states of psychosis or schizophrenia aren't going to avail themselves of tools the way an autistic individual typically can. The other is that what is similar is that the states of disorientation, because of the anxiety on internal arousal states, are both so high in autism and schizophrenia that it gets confused, because people can be very disoriented. To use kind of a little bit of a slang analogy for anyone who's been on a playground years ago maybe, when we were kids, we often would swing on the monkey rings from one monkey ring to the next. Well, in autism, you need to know what that next monkey ring is to feel stable. If you were to swing on a monkey ring and you didn't have the next monkey ring to grab, you'd feel very distressed. So a lot of the task analysis and the schedules and social stories and all those tools we use are helping somebody know what is the next thing, what is the next event, what is next on my schedule, who's the next staff person that's going to be with me. The interesting thing when I've worked with individuals that are truly in the psychosis realm, you could give them a lot of visuals, tools and schedules, and it really wouldn't be as effective because they're often very consumed in their thinking processes. So right away, when I see an individual that can respond to tools and schedule and routine and calm down, that's somewhat indicative, not always. But the other is that this disorientation seems to be what some people end up relying on that results in a misdiagnosis, because both can be disoriented. The other is hearing voices. I cannot tell you how many individuals I've served on the autistic spectrum talk about voices. They will tell you they hear voices, they'll repeat voices. What I noticed the difference to operationalize that is that when I've worked with individuals that are truly more paranoid schizophrenic diagnosis, the voices that they're hearing could be external, whether it's as religious themes of devil or angels or those kinds of things. When I work with individuals on the autistic spectrum, often it's a very concrete voice they actually heard. They're repeating it again and again and again, and it may be out of context. It might have been a voice they heard when they were 7 and they're 35. And if you don't take the time to find out it was an actual conversation that they actually heard, that they're repeating and even perseverating over, you may confuse it for the voices that you would see in something more typically like schizophrenia. So it's really critical to understand that that perseveration on a past voice, most typically one that was judgmental or very critical, a critical comment, a judgment was made, and they're repeating it again and again, because most of the individuals I've served on the autistic spectrum, and I'm speaking of adults here, really wish to do the right thing. They want to do the right thing. They want to be good, they want to be successful, and sometimes when they heard a critical judging comment, they didn't understand what they'd done wrong, and they will go over and over again to try to remedy what is the right way to behave in a social situation. So often it's really critical to understand the genesis of the voices and what function they're serving for that person. In terms of what works, regardless of that state that I find people in, as confused as their diagnosis may be, I try to break it into 3 domains. It's almost like a pie chart if it had 3 large pieces. The self, the individual self, sense of self. People need to have, all beings need a sense of self-esteem, feeling good and productive and capable in our environment with the individuals that we're socializing with. Other, the staff or family, whomever in their community, and then their environment. So what I'm looking at when I go into a critical moment in time, how is this individual feeling about themselves? How are they interacting with others? Often there's a lot of isolation, and a lot of individuals are just served by staff only, and will often report they have no friends, they only have paid staff, which also affects their sense of self or self-esteem. If everyone that knows you is paid, that's a very challenging situation to be in. And the environment, what is a trigger or an antecedent in the environment? And I'm trying to create stability in all 3 domains, in their sense of self, integrity, esteem, how the individuals in their circle of support are supporting them, and how the environment is either triggering them or stabilizing them. And one thing we know again and again, if somebody asks me, what's one thing that I could do, or anyone could do, to create a greater quality of life, greater success and functioning and stability, it's consistency. And that's different than rigidity. It's not rigidity, it's consistency. And we also are trying to build in the tools so that individuals can learn flexibility and can learn to what we call desensitization around some triggers or antecedents that are evocative. But one thing I find is that whatever services are available for adults on the autistic spectrum, there's such a profound inconsistency that it's actually creating instability. So I try to gather the whole circle of support together. I try to find out for this unique individual, what is it that they need and how to create that kind of consistency. And then what I found, which I very much appreciate, is that once the consistency or those reference points like the monkey rings are in place, the individual on the spectrum can learn a profound amount of skills, self-coping skills, emotional self-regulation, even social skills interpersonally with others in their environment. But that old adage, you can't teach a man to swim who's drowning. If there's so much instability, it affects the learning. If we can create stability first, then the arousal state will decrease. We know from neuroscience there is a lot of neuroplasticity in all beings, including on the spectrum. And with the reduction of stimulus and not being overstimulated, or that arousal state not being so heightened all the time, cognition increases and learning can increase. So I'm trying to bring the supports to a place of consistency to create stability, to actually increase cognition and learning, to then create more flexibility, to be less reactive thereafter. It's a little bit of a method to the madness. One thing we know, though, about self-regulation and coping skills is they need to be learned and taught in relationship to a someone who is safe to that person. So we know on the autistic spectrum, people have what we call preferred staff, someone they feel very safe with, they don't feel judged by. That's a great person to help teach the other staff what works. What is it that you're doing that seems to be so effective? Could you please share that with other people in the circle of support? And in that way, that also can help build that sense of self-esteem at being more successful, because one is able to have more self-regulation internally that was originally borrowed by this external preferred staff or parent, whomever it be. And the other I was mentioning in these domains, self, other, and environment. One of the things that's sometimes hard to teach, but I try, how can we not be judgmental? How can we not be critical, but use what we call discretion, discernment? We're discerning what is needed. We're discerning what would be helpful. That's very different than judgment and criticism. This is a domain that individuals are very sensitive to because of the challenges or even impairments in social cues, which everyone I've met is very aware of, wishing and wanting to be successful. So in that way, when I'm working with someone, I really want to make sure that I'm expressing myself in a way that is using my discretion and discernment for efficacy to reach goals, but not judging or criticizing someone who may feel lesser than and is just having different perception. And that's something I'm constantly trying to encourage in individuals is use your intelligence, but try not to express judgment of this individual. Help them learn what they need to know. There's great capacity there.
Sherri, a quick question regarding the comorbidity of psychosis and autism. How common is it, and is it necessary really to separate out in terms of treatment and the support framework system, part of which you set up and help organize? That's
a great question. If you were to operationalize, and I don't mean the kind of traditional psychiatric view of definition or diagnosis of psychosis, but in a critical moment in time, if somebody is disoriented and doesn't understand where they are or what is going on, you could say that's a psychotic presentation in that moment. So why do you need to differentiate whether it's truly autism or schizophrenia? You want to make sure somebody doesn't get hit by a bus, doesn't run into traffic. I mean, you just need people to be safe. What I'm actually speaking to is I've seen individuals on the autistic spectrum when they're properly diagnosed, and we know they're truly on ASD, that at a calm level, not overstimulated, not responding to antecedents or triggers, very functional, relatively speaking. And then some stressor comes into the environment, and then they start kind of escalating into a higher arousal state, and then they start presenting in a more psychotic-like way that looks very disoriented, losing reference points, not knowing how to navigate their environment. But the difference about that, though, is that though in that moment they're still not oriented enough to function effectively, the genesis of it is an internal sense of anxiety or even lack of social skills or self-esteem. Whereas when I'm with someone who really is more on the schizophrenic spectrum, you could say, the genesis is very different. It's usually consumed with some inner thought world of something, the metaphysics of the world or something. So the reason why I say that makes a difference is because when I show up to create stability, I have to understand what's generating the escalated arousal state to be able to effectively stabilize it. So I still care whether someone's able to cross the street or run into traffic or not, but the way that I can meet that person is very different. So I think it is to say that all beings, I mean, the good news is, all beings have ability to reduce arousal states and learn self-regulation, no matter who we are, what diagnosis we have. And one thing I say is, you could say, a little bit slang, is, the good news is extreme states of mind, or insanity, if you will, is not solid, it's not permanent. It fluxes and wanes. And the bad news is sanity is not solid either. So, what I'm looking is to create the greatest consistency of functionality without judging that, but also being aware that when people lose those reference points and lose function because of the arousal state, it can be lethal and dangerous no matter what your diagnosis is. And that's where I come in, because I receive calls on a daily basis of people that have, on autistic adults, have become so aroused and so overstimulated or escalated. They're about ready to jump off a bridge, they're running into a freeway, they're talking about other, extreme behaviors that's my job to stabilize. So I don't know if that answers your question, but...
No, it helps clarify the question. It just leads me to another question. I'll try to keep this short. Does treatment, say with antipsychotics, ever work at cross purposes with the treatment of the autism, or, well, let me just ask that, keep it short.
I think probably Dr. Hendren will probably speak to medications, because that's his domain versus mine. What I will say from my experience, which is different than a psychiatrist, is that anyone who is feeling anxious or frightened or scared, escalated arousal states, does benefit from some kind of medication that internally can help feel like that arousal state is going to take someone away from themselves. And so whether they're truly antipsychotics or they're anti-anxiety or anti-agitation, there's one, the first and foremost need for medical assessment, because without medications, though it is possible with a lot of external supports and a lot of environmental controls, there is a need for that ability to actually have some more stability within oneself, which is what medications do. So one thing I will say, though, about what Dr. Ball was talking about, a lot of what's been offered previously to individuals on the spectrum from the world of applied behavioral analysis has been early intervention. What we're seeing is ABA tools are still helpful for adults and can be, we use them all the time. And things like visuals, tangibles, and schedule, structure, consistency, which is part of what ABA is to early intervention, is equally helpful to adults with autism. What we're also finding is relationships are key. Relationships are key. And consistent relationships are key. And consistent relationships that are not judging and criticizing someone are key. So if we could create these consistent relationships that are helping discern what is needed and needs to be learned in a supportive and non-judging, non-critical way, great success is possible. And that's what I'm trying to encourage in any environment I go into. I was just doing 2 hours teaching Sonoma County Jail, inside the jail, with Lieutenant David House and Sergeant Debbie Pitkin. I spent 2 hours trying to help them learn what would be helpful when an individual on the autistic spectrum comes into their care as an inmate. And I kept saying, consistency, schedule, relationships, non-judgment. And luckily, they were very receptive to that and are willing to hopefully not have many individuals come into their care, which we don't like to see, but at least when that does occur, provide the proper supports. And we do have a lot of adults that, when their needs are not met proactively, do end up unfortunately, getting a forensic or criminal record because of the states that they become distressed and do various behaviors that end up getting 911 calls, 5150s. And we hate to see that. I don't want to see someone developing a criminal forensic record to get the help they need. I much prefer to proactively provide it to prevent that from happening. But when it does occur, there are some things we know are very helpful. The irony being, one thing about a jail, it's very consistent, it's very structured. I had somebody who spent, unfortunately, a 35-year-old woman on the autistic spectrum, spent 2 months in a county jail. And when she came out into the community, she didn't have the consistent relationships and support she needed, such that she wanted to go back to jail because it was more consistent and structured for her needs, which to me is tragic. That's not what I want to see. So what I would, in wanting to encourage, is that all of our communities take it upon ourselves to proactively provide supports and not let people get into a state such as that to get their needs met. And in that way, what is unfortunately occurring and has been for years is the budgets have been cut for both mental health and often supports for developmentally disabled individuals, while the budgets for crisis intervention has been going up. I would prefer to, the best time to stabilize a crisis is before it ever happens. So in that way, I know I'm just wanting to wrap up that there is a lot of opportunity through the lifespan to learn. But again, back to that, you can't teach a drowning man how to swim. You have to create a lot of consistency and stability first to then develop those tools and those skills and those desensitizations to typical antecedents. And I think one of the things I'm finding in the community is, the world we're in can be very overstimulating for any of us. Sounds, lights, stimulus. So actually I was in Sonoma County. Again, I serve Sonoma, Napa, Solano County, and I heard a radio ad that was actually, for all things, Mary's Pizza. Not that I'm advocating for that, and it said, if you have an individual on the autistic spectrum, please come to Mary's Pizza. We have a quiet room, we have tangibles, and we've got tools for your ASD individual. I'd never heard a radio ad like that before. I was very pleased by that. I would imagine, I'm guessing somebody has someone on the spectrum in their family, but they were specifically saying, we're going to create a space that's quiet and that's not overstimulating. We're going to give you some tools so you can come into our establishment and you can be part of our community. And I would like to encourage us to all think of ways that we can offer that kind of support to our community members, whether they're existing on the spectrum or not. And even not that long ago, I was with a friend, off hours, off work. We were in a movie theater. Somebody was rocking and repeating and getting anxious about the movie. And the person next to me kind of made some comment like, why doesn't that person just be quiet? And I said, I would like to suggest that individual may be an adult with autism. And then that same friend called me 3 weeks later, and they said, Sherri, after you told me that little kind of Autism 101, I was at a street corner in San Francisco, and I saw somebody kind of rocking and seemingly anxious about crossing the street. And I went over to that person and I said, can I help you cross the street? So within 3 weeks' time, with just a little bit of education, this person went from reacting to somebody in a movie theater to helping someone cross the street. And that's what I like to see, is developing relationships and understanding, because the isolation and lack of support when people are out in the community is pretty profound. And not everyone has the good fortune of having either family or staff that are as attuned to the needs. So even that heightened reactivity is very distressing to someone, that you can't function and navigate your community in a way that's with acceptance. I think one thing I wanted to talk about, Dr. Ball mentioned as I conclude, is, we're looking at goals. Well, my goal would be not just for the individual on the spectrum to learn skills, but for the community to learn skills. I want our communities to learn skills, not just individuals. And in that way, it's not just that the reactivity and desensitization or the emotional regulation needs to be for an adult with autism. It also needs to be community members who are less reactive to the presentation of adults with autism and can regulate themselves when they see a behavior, as my friend did in the movie theater. And also, understanding that all human beings, I don't know if we're up to almost 8 billion on the planet now, have arousal states. We all can be evoked and triggered. And at some point, somebody had to help us learn how to regulate our own stimulus, our own arousal states. So it might be more heightened, and it certainly is on the adult, ASD spectrum. But in that way, what can we all learn and help engender in adults with autism that's not just saying you're the only one with that struggle, because we all have it. So I like to say, I like to have a more sense of inclusivity, both in the learning and the sharing and in the community, than just segregation, which isn't going to help anyone. And integration is really what I'm interested in, and how we can have more courage of the heart to do that.